You know, throughout the entirety of this game, there was one prevailing thought I had that just would not go away. This character model is very out of place. Tormented Souls is a survival horror game in the vein of classics of the genre, and it makes it very clear that this is the experience you're in for. Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and Alone in the Dark are proudly displayed as influences, with aspects of all three evident over the course of the game. You control Caroline Walker, a shoujo protagonist accidentally lifted from her manga and placed inelegantly in the middle of the abandoned Wildberger hospital, after a photograph of a pair of twins is mailed to her with an invitation to come see what's going on for herself. And so, of course, off she goes, kitted out in the pinnacle of impractical clothing, and upon entering the hospital, she's bonked across the bunts. From here, the premise is simple: find out what's going on and get the hell out. Mechanically, Tormented Souls is a standard third-person point-and-click exploration and brain-melting puzzle adventure game. You'll be hunting through every nook and cranny in search of the thing you need to interact with, hoarding ammo for the inevitable beasties you'll be mowing down, and piecing together the history of the Wildberger Hospital through scattered notes and diary entries. Like the Spencer Mansion and RPD station before it, the hospital is not huge, but it is complex, with much of the enjoyment coming from learning the layout of the hospital and gradually getting used to navigating without the map. Finding paths around the destruction and decay of the building, uncovering shortcuts, unlocking doors and passing through a hallway to be greeted by a familiar sight is just as satisfying as it has always been in survival horror, and it is all massively aided by the sheer scope and spectacle of the hospital proper. As a monument of excess, one of my earliest thoughts about the hospital was that it looked more like a manor house than anything, and as it turned out it was indeed a modified mansion. For all its faults, one thing that the developers have absolutely nailed is the look and feel of Wildberger, and how to encourage exploration and confidence as more and more paths open up before you. Supplementing the stunning design is an excellent atmospheric soundtrack. There are moments throughout the game that have soft, soothing orchestral music. The save room has its own dedicated theme, of course, but for the most part the soundtrack is very much along the lines of the earlier Silent Hill games. Mashing, smashing, grinding machinery, horrific ambience that unsettles and leers from the darkness, or deep throbbing bass noises, the distant sound of shrieking beasts and broken gears. It is largely put to great use, with the biggest downside being that at times it really feels like there is noise for the sake of there being noise. Rare is it that the game is actually quiet, and sometimes this works against it. By the end of the game, I was very much done with the obnoxiously loud atmospherics. Jesus Christ game, calm the hell down. As a relatively low-budget indie game published by P-Cube, proprietors of games like White Day, Nexamon and Galgun, it's immediately clear where the majority of the cost has gone. Tormented Souls is, for the most part, a stunningly gorgeous game. Its central property lifts a good deal of inspiration from the aforementioned Spencer Mansion, with its own architectural flair. Marble statues judge your every step, doors often have abnormal methods of unlocking and opening, and there are a shocking number of doors that cannot be opened from this side. To begin with, you're held in a single wing of the building, able to access only a small number of rooms as you slowly start to pick apart where you are and how you got there. Dear old Caroline is horrified to realise that she has lost an eye, and so the hunt is on to figure out why she was sent the photograph and why she's been robbed of an organ. But before she does that, she absolutely must stop to examine every single aspect of the hospital, because this place is goddamn gorgeous. Even as you progress throughout the game and begin to uncover the obligatory underground sections, the only real downside is that they are excessively dark and rooms begin to look just a little too similar, making navigating and figuring out where you have and haven't been a bit tiresome. That said, the areas that don't feature the level of variety and attention to detail that the hospital itself has don't last particularly long and are much smaller in comparison. The game is balanced very well, never feeling as though it outstays its welcome and coming to an end at the perfect length for a game of this calibre and genre. As a result, despite there being areas that I disliked in terms of design, I never felt like they actively detracted from the overall experience. There's a fine line between inspiration and imitation, and though there were certainly plenty of times that the scenery of Tormented Souls hit a little close to the latter, it harbours more than enough of its own uniqueness to stand out as a fresh new coat of paint on a stale, rotting genre. Committed as it is, the game utilises all the staples of the classic genre: fixed camera angles that are, on occasion, dynamic and unsettling, a manual examine and combine inventory system wherein items must be interacted with directly in the inventory rather than the game handling it for you, for example, unwinding the wrench you receive in the first room to use it as a makeshift door handle. There are limited saves, limited ability to aim, baffling and logic-defying puzzles, and a whole lot more besides. Oftentimes you'll enter a room and be struck by a distant scraping sound, unsure as to whether it's an enemy or just the general atmosphere. The building creaks and groans, and whispers in the background remind you that you are never alone. Tormented Souls marketing has made a big deal of its admiration of its predecessors, and it's not unwarranted. For the most part, it does an excellent job of tying together its multiple classic systems with a generally simple plot. Generally. And though it can take a little getting used to the tank controls of yore, once you're in the groove, it all works fairly well. That said, this is absolutely a controller game. With the rare exception of interacting with a handful of finicky puzzles, this is not a game that you'll want to use a keyboard and mouse for. The default speed on keyboard for WASD movement is walking, meaning you'll constantly need to have shift depressed to move at a reasonable speed. This also makes turning or any even remotely precise movements extremely awkward, although even with a controller you will still find yourself pirouetting on the spot if you happen to hit a dodgy camera angle, or try to turn in a direction the game has arbitrarily decided it doesn't like today. All the staples of the genre have been carefully preserved here, and sadly that does include many faults. Particularly in the early game, the limited ammo and save system can cause you to go for an hour or more without finding the item you need to save the game, as unlike in Resident Evil, where the majority of inspiration is drawn, the tape reels you need to save the game can only be used once, and it's only at around the halfway point in the game where you start to find significant numbers of them. Enemies deal an unreasonable amount of damage even from the off, as despite the fact that there is an escalation of the types and strengths of the enemies you find, none of them really deal more or less damage than one another, they just look and move slightly differently. The basic enemies, these charming little guys who drag themselves around on their arse, can knock you from fine to caution in one hit, and it takes a further 2 hits to drop you down to danger. These same enemies also take an ungodly amount of punishment regardless of how large they are, making running out of ammo a very real threat throughout the entirety of the game, which is not something you want to have happen towards the game's final act. If you get caught by more than one enemy and either can't get away, or backed into a corner, or haven't quite mastered the dodge mechanic, it can quickly result in a game over. Enemies don't appear for a fair while at the start of the game, and you will have found and likely used your first and only tape reel long before any enemies actually appear, by which point a struggling player might already throw in the towel. In the first 3 hours of the game, I only found 3 saves. As there is no difficulty selection, anyone who struggles with acclimating to the controls may be unfairly punished for having the gall to want to save their game a little more frequently. This is not a beginner-friendly game, and whilst I appreciate that this is the point given its inspirations, even the old Resident Evil games had difficulty selection. Speaking of difficulty, one aspect of the game that's receiving a good deal of praise are the puzzles themselves, and in truth, it's deserved. Although I have my gripes, the adventure game logic is strong with this one. The puzzles are bold, new and different, and difficult. Logic puzzles that require a keen eye and deductive reasoning are the game's strongest aspects, and easily the most infuriating as well. Some people are good with puzzles and some aren't. There's no shame in being bad at puzzles like this, and though they are frequent throughout the first half of the game, as the story and tension ramps up, the number of puzzles you'll face start to decrease. Though that's not to say that they get any easier. In point of fact, one of the game's worst puzzles occurs at around the 3/4 mark and is easily the most confusing thing that doesn't require memorising Shakespeare that I've ever come across. I won't talk about the puzzles too much because they are absolutely a standout feature of Tormented Souls, but I will say there are a few of them that are a little bit too obtuse in how you solve them, and there were at least 2 instances of puzzles that I had to look up because I'd been running around for half an hour and could not for the life of me find whatever it was that was supposed to help me figure it out. There was also one puzzle that requires you to memorise the melody of a piece of music, then play it back using a series of unlabelled buttons. So good luck if you're hard of hearing or tone deaf. I know Resident Evil 3 had the music box puzzle too, but we have moved on in the 22 years since that game was released. If you're interested, I'll post a link to the PowerPyx page that I used for the puzzles I couldn't beat into submission in the description below. Back to the topic of budget, while the game does look extremely good and plays well for the most part, the limitations are apparent as soon as you meet another character. An elderly priest, dressed in a green bomber jacket because of course. The game has minimal cutscenes, with the majority of conversations being rendered in-game. Mouths don't move, and dear god the voice acting is bad. I'm not entirely sure if this was deliberate or just a product of the low budget and unknown cast. If the former, then the developers clearly forgot that the terrible voice acting of the olden days was as horrible as it was charming and quotable. Tormented Souls voice acting is simply bad, distractingly so, and whilst lip sync is something I can live with given how the Souls franchise has eschewed it for a decade now, the low quality of the voices often drew me out of the experience. This is also a result of the poor writing. The developer is from Chile, meaning that the game's original language is actually Spanish, which is fairly easy to note given that the majority of the handwritten diaries you find in the game are clearly in Spanish when you're examining them. As a result of the lack in translation, there are frequent times when what's being said and what's written in the subtitles don't match at all, as well as times where there are missing letters or writing on the wall that is being spoken aloud, but Caroline is apparently reading something completely different because that is not what that says, sweetheart. Much like the voice acting and lip sync, these issues aren't deal breakers, but they are distracting, and given how much polish has gone into the environments, level design, and the genuinely impressive puzzles, it strikes me as unfortunate that even half the care given to those parts of the game wasn't reserved for the translation. It's clear where the vast majority of the developer's attention was focused, and though it did turn out very well, it couldn't have hurt to have a native English speaker have a quick pass through the game to point out the errors. It might help matters if Caroline wasn't a monumental dunce of the pointy paper hat variety. Numerous times I audibly groaned at the game as Caroline questioned something she already knew the answer to or said something utterly inept. Like showing a photograph of a young girl to said young girl and asking that very same young girl, "Is this you? What do you think, genius?" Thankfully, conversations and cutscenes that actively involve spoken dialogue are few and far between. Caroline is silent whilst exploring and thankfully does not have an anime girl death rattle if she does happen to shuffle off the mortal coil. Thank God. Other small niggling issues jump out as being a result of oversight more than anything. There's no dedicated map button, which even the older Resident Evil and Silent Hill games had, and the map itself is functionally worthless. No matter where you are in the hospital, accessing the map through the menu will never bring up the actual hall that you're currently in. A minor inconvenience easily solved by just having a dedicated map button and not separating the maps by east and west wings, just have floor 1, floor 2, basement, and so on. I also encountered a fair number of bugs. There was nothing game-breaking, but there was a moment when I was trapped in an infinite loop of spinning in circles because the game's fixed camera couldn't work out which angle it needed to swap to. There is also one particular enemy who appears at around halfway through the game, who cannot be killed. When I first came across this creature, I genuinely thought that my game had glitched, as I had stun-locked it into a corner with a crowbar and wailed on it for several long minutes before assuming it had broken and just leaving the room. Upon returning, the monster had disappeared, and I soon discovered you weren't actually really meant to fight it, which I wish I would have known before I wasted all my ammo on what I thought was a mini-boss. Instead, the creature will randomly appear in a room that you've just entered and float menacingly after you in search of chompy cuddles. It's also accompanied by a specific audio cue, meaning that every single time I entered a room and that audio cue played, I would roll my eyes, turn around and walk right back out again, as this immediately despawns the enemy. So, a word of advice, because you will know this creature when you meet it. Don't waste the ammo and time trying to kill it. If you hear that stark string sting, just leave the room and then re-enter it. It makes the enemy a joke, but it's much easier to deal with the floating fury that way, believe me. A particular grievance of mine, because I am a nitpicky little bugger, is the inconsistency of whether or not items sparkle at you. In basically every survival horror game worth its salt, and some that aren't, items tend to shimmer. The reason for this is simple: horror games are dark, and in the dark it's really rather difficult to see if there's anything you can interact with. So if there's even the slightest possibility that you might miss the puzzle item you need to pick up, the damn thing will sparkle at you like a fairy in denial until you pick it up. In Tormented Souls, a game that gets dark as all hell in its final act especially, some items will shimmer and some won't. The overwhelming majority of items that you can pick up, whether it's ammo, puzzle items, keys, or basically anything that goes in your general inventory, will not sparkle. Other items, or specifically interactable objects, will. This trolley, for example, sparkles furiously until you complete the puzzle it's involved in, but the vending machine that is also necessary to interact with at one point doesn't. For the first half of the game, you'll only have access to a lighter that has to be unequipped if you want to pull out a weapon, making it easy to miss ammo, tape reel, and actual other important items. I'm not mad that it took 3 passes to find that one box of ammo, it's the inconsistency that bothers me. This mattered less in the 90s Resident Evil games because the backgrounds were pre-rendered, so it was always extremely clear what you could and could not interact with. And when you've been running around for a literal hour trying to find whatever it is you've missed, only to stumble across a fridge in a room you've been through 3 times that is almost pitch black, that you have to pull backwards to reveal a secret passageway, the absence of glittery sparkles is deeply felt. Make everything that can be interacted with sparkle, or make nothing sparkle. Not half and half. I do have another more specific gripe to discuss, but this will involve spoilers, so if you're interested in playing the game yourself, it's best to bow out here. In non-spoilery conclusion, despite how much I've ragged on some of the game's worst parts, what's here is genuinely very good, especially for the low price. The game retails at around £16 or your regional equivalent on Steam at least. And for 8 to 10 hours of content, depending on how stuck you get, for a game that looks this damn good and whose exploration is so deeply rewarding, that is a great price. When I reviewed Little Nightmares 2, I complained that the price of the game was too high for the amount of content it had, and there were a few people who disagreed for their own reasons, supporting the developers, value for money being subjective, and so on, which I completely respect and agree with. I've bought games twice to support a developer I like. Games like Tormented Souls remind me of why I make statements like that. £16 for 8 to 10 hours of content is a third of the price of the average Call of Duty game and double the campaign length. It's 2/3 of the price of Little Nightmares 2 with double the length. When I was a kid, my family had very little money to spend on non-essentials, so when I wanted a new game, I learnt to be sure that what I was getting would be great value for money, which is why I am so obsessively familiar with the Spencer Mansion, and why I still adore Perfect Dark. And even now, for all the games that I've been able to go back and play after years of not being able to afford anything, the £20-ish I've spent on The Binding of Isaac has been the best gaming decision I've ever made, for the hundreds upon hundreds of hours I've put into it. I'm not saying that something being cheap means it's automatically good, or that something expensive is automatically bad. What I am saying is that I paid £45 for Black Ops on release day, and after finishing the campaign in 3.5 hours, I was more than a little bit miffed. Anyway, the point is that for the price, and for the parts of it that are truly fantastic, Tormented Souls is an easy recommendation. Yes, the voice acting is bad, and yes, there are some inconvenient bugs. The enemies are a little bit too spongy, and the puzzles can be controller breaking in their defiance of logic. But when it all comes together, when you finally open that door that's been locked for hours, or when you finally find where to use that one item that you've been carrying around since the very start of the game, it is incredibly satisfying. It's somewhat appropriate that the first 2/3 of the game are vastly superior to the last third, given its similarity to the Resident Evil remake specifically, but what is here for an unknown team is a true love letter to survival horror that, despite its flaws, was by far more enjoyable than it was frustrating. At least I didn't have to spend the entire game screaming at the protagonist to shut up. So, on to spoilers. I'm going to complain some more because that is my lot in life as an ageing Brit. To be able to talk about what bothered me the most in Tormented Souls, I need to talk about one specific mechanic that was either an homage to Silent Hill Origins that went badly wrong, or something someone thought was cool and nobody really considered how badly it fit into the rest of the game. Let me explain. Throughout the game, you will come across mirrors or screens of some form or another that will allow you to travel into either an other world of some kind or into the past. The literal past. This game features time travel, and if you're here for an interesting story, the time travel is the biggest detriment to this game of all. Without the time travel element, the story is a traditional religious guy goes bananas and tries to birth God. It's simple, inelegant, and terribly voice acted, just as expected. But the introduction of time travel, whilst at first easily hand-waved by suggesting it could just be a hallucination, ends up playing a major factor into one of the game's endings, wherein Caroline walks through a projector screen to 14 years in the past, and drags her then child-aged twin sister back out into the present with her. Time travel is a difficult beast. It's very rare that stories involving time travel are logically sound, for the obvious reason that it's just too easy to bollock something up without even realising. Sent your character back in time to cause the event that got them in this situation to begin with, boom, closed loop time paradox a la Blair Witch 2016. Went back in time and murdered yourself? Grandfather paradox. Matthewmatosis has an excellent video on Bioshock Infinite that goes into more detail discussing this, and I'll link it in the description below. The reason why the time travel is such a big sticking point for me is that it just doesn't need to be there. It adds nothing to the game and distorts what should be an otherwise easily digestible story. There is an explanation for everything in the game, except the time travel. It's never explained why the projector can send Caroline back in time to extremely specific parts of the hospital, and whilst it could have been used to form an interesting gameplay mechanic or be used to affect the hospital in bigger, better ways, it's almost exclusively used to solve a puzzle that has an arbitrary restriction. For example, can't charge that battery now, it'll take days, let's take it to the past with us and leave it on charge there so when we come back we can pick it up from the same room and wow, it's fully charged. What's weird about all this is that the game isn't consistent about how it implements itself into the narrative. Early on, when you first meet the priest, he mentions that you'd already met a few days ago, although Caroline obviously only arrived at the mansion the previous day and was immediately knocked out. She has no recollection of meeting this guy before. Later, you find a tape that takes you back a few days where you can find and speak to the priest. This suggests that the time travel is already a factor and has already happened. It's not time travel in the sense that time is a line and you're hopping back just once and changing one thing to affect the present in a specific way. Rather, time is a circle. It's already happened and so is guaranteed to happen again. But then you find this experiment room where there's a child's skeleton in the cell locked in place with a thick padlock, so you go back in the past and pour acid on the chain, noting that it will take days to break. When you return to the present, the padlock is broken and the child's skeleton is gone. In her place is a note saying that she met a weird lady who melted the padlock and set her free. But surely there should never have been a skeleton in that cell to begin with. And if the sister originally died, then why would Grandfather Noah, the big bad guy bomber jacket priest man, ever have summoned Caroline to the mansion, since he would have had no reason to know that she existed? Actually, now that I think about it, because of the weird contrivance with the priest's arms that I just won't get into because I'm already turned upside down, he didn't even need the twins themselves. He just needed their eyes, but if time travel worked the way it's supposed to, then when you return to the present after using the acid the first time, shouldn't Noah have no idea why you're there? And in turn, shouldn't you have not lost an eye? Precisely how Noah found out Caroline was alive is a point of contention as well, but I'm already deeply entrenched in my confusion and thinking about this is painful. It's very much a weak Deus Ex Machina to make sure that Caroline has the option to reunite with her sister at the end, since her actual current-day sister dies horribly during the course of the narrative. So instead, the game's good ending has you travel back to the past to use the bolt cutters to free the kid immediately, and bring her back to the present with you, but surely freeing her so suddenly would unravel the entire game, since one of the game's monsters at a huge plot point revolves around the sister living in the sewers for 14 years before being captured by Noah again. Who made these tapes? Why? Why was the priest recording himself praying in front of the Jesus statue? Look, I know seeking logic in a game like this is pointless. Nobody ever said the Resident Evil games had a coherent plot, and God knows that the whole magic spell angle of Silent Hill was always a bit silly. But Silent Hill had the virtue of at least sticking to its guns. Its very silly guns. There was a magic spell, it went wrong, you kill God, and in doing so your daughter is rebirthed as a purer being. Simple. In Resident Evil, you go to the big spooky mansion to find out what happened, and at the end you blow it up. Nothing too complicated, and that's what the majority of Tormented Souls' plot is. The game is excessively descriptive about everything else in its plot, so why even bother throwing in the wacky time travel angle? We're not playing these games for that plot, so why overcomplicate it in such a way that nitpicky idiots like me will be confused and bewildered by it? When the game's level design and puzzles are this good, the sudden devolution to time travel territory is unnecessary. The game already has a strong foundation, it didn't need this mechanic to confuse matters. Anyway, I've rambled enough, so let's wrap this up. In summary, Tormented Souls is an interesting game that makes a great foundation for a perfect follow-up. Clean up some of those niggling aspects, especially the issues with the map, add some difficulty options and tidy up the translation and subtitling issues. Compound on the simplicity of the game's core narrative, and with a few tweaks here and there, we could get something truly special. But for the love of God, if you're going to keep up the time travel aspects, please just don't take any cues from 12 minutes, especially not from 12 minutes story.